morning, good afternoon, good evening. I am so thrilled to invite Dr. Shefaly Yogendra for the next episode of Wonder Women. Shefaly is somebody I have known for maybe a couple of decades already. She is a portfolio non-executive director on several boards and coaches and advises boards and CXOs on emerging technologies and related risks and opportunities. A very unique profile, I must say, definitely on the Wonder Woman lineup. A very warm welcome to you, Shefaly. How are you today?
Thank you for having me, Shivangi. I'm well, and I look forward to our conversation.
I've been looking forward to this conversation for sure. And, just for our audience, can you tell us a little bit about your journey and what has brought you to these NED roles that you are in, which I feel, for somebody with a Wonder Woman profile are probably quite unique. So, but love to, know a little bit about your life and professional trajectory.
Thank you. So, as you said, I have a portfolio of non-executive positions. And currently, I am on an investment company or two investment companies that own equities, one that owns real assets, which really means infrastructure assets. Also on the board as an independent director of a company that owns several law firms in the regions in the UK. And I have earlier been on a university board. There are similarities and differences, but the interesting thing here is that this is traditionally referred to as a portfolio career. But my portfolio career began 25 years ago when I started to work independently and worked with startup scale ups on one end, large listed corporations on another, regulators, policymakers, investors, both at the small end, like a venture investor, and larger end, private equity investor, and people who were trying to influence them. So I have done work in political affairs and understand how the lobbying activity happens. So my portfolio life goes back 25 years. But I started my career in corporate venturing, which is a fancy term for creating new businesses inside a large corporation. And that is how I came to Switzerland, which is the common thread that's how we met. So in coming to that life in the first place, I first trained as an engineer. But the thing that persists as a through line or a thread throughout my career is that I bring a multidisciplinary toolkit to my thinking and my approach. And I do feel that everything we do is accretive. So everything you do previously will inform the next step you make. And I channel Heraclitus a little bit in saying nobody steps in the same river twice. So it has been similar with all my education and all my experience. Everything improves the next thing. So that's my way of conducting my journey. And I hope that that adds value as a non-exec director in boards as well.
Yeah, thank you for that, Shefali. You have been a part of, and again, speaking of gender, probably not too many women surround you in the kind of roles that you have experienced throughout your career. I'm just wondering, what is your definition of a sense of belonging, and how have you felt or not felt it as you have taken these diverse roles and positions in your career?
I think belonging comes from inside more than from outside. And that may be a controversial thing to say, especially where it is heard by people who don't feel they belong. But I think belonging comes from a solid core inside us. And I often make the point that the confidence I feel in myself and my own centrality is not dependent on external factors. So, in a very small way, and you know me, I'm not a giant person, physically speaking. I enter a space and I feel that I belong here already. Otherwise, I won't be there. I mean, I'm never going to be a wedding crasher by that definition. But when you're invited into a place or you're inside a room or at a table, you already belong. It is up to you to make sure that that belonging actually adds value and creates value in the room. So I feel belonging is something that comes from inside.
Hmm. I mean, you had a stint in Switzerland, and now you call the United Kingdom as your home for many, many years. I'm just wondering what kind of cultural traditions, and we share a home country, we both come from India. What kind of cultural traditions of India do you continue to still observe and celebrate? Do they actually mean anything, or how has their meaning changed for you?
So, one other thing, other than sharing the commonality of being from India, is that we grew up in pre-liberalization India. When I completed my management program in IIM Ahmedabad, we were given our diplomas at the graduation ceremony by Dr. Manmohan Singh, who, as we know, was the architect of India's liberalization policies. But we grew up in the period before that. So I would say one cultural tradition which I don't think any longer holds in Indians living in India is resource conservation and value extraction. That is something that guides me throughout it has guided me throughout my entire life. It continues to guide me. So for instance, there is a conversation about water conservation. I have never been the person who lets the tap run while she's brushing her teeth. That comes from being an Indian. Equally, when I'm in my board roles, I'm very conscious of the money we are spending and what is it doing for my shareholders in terms of value creation. It is not that different. And that mindset of resource conservation and maximizing value extraction actually is a common thread and a cultural tradition that I continue. Hasn't hurt me anyway. My gas bills are not as small as I would like, but it's not because I waste gas in any form. So I think those are the key things that have remained with me from growing up in India when I did.
So are those more at a values level for you, Shefali? Like how are those manifesting for you? I think of traditions and rituals a bit different than values. I think what you mentioned seems to me more like a value. And I'm interested more also in, any surprising discoveries that you have made about yourself. Sometimes when we do not live in a home context or a home country context. And I'm very curious about that for Wonder Woman. I guess we start looking at ourselves a bit differently because I think it's easier to observe ourselves outside of the context in which we were born, right? What have you noticed about yourself? What has surprised you?
I think one of the things which I have found difficult in a lot of Western contexts, and I often say this to my friends, and then I find that it's not as different as it looks compared to India, is that you feel coming from India that you are part of a large continuum. Whereas I have witnessed people either talking about it, not always practicing, or sometimes practicing. But the minute a child turns 18, you're on your own. You're an adult. You're supposed to look after yourself, find your own income. You have to pay rent in the house, of, even if it's your parents' house. That has been a difficult thing for me to get my head around. But when I look closely, I have a lot of friends from very many different cultures. They all operate a version of that continuum. So we are not that different in humanity terms. It is just that the external manifestation or the external observer, perch from where we look at things, they might look a little bit different. So I feel that that feeling of coming from a continuum and therefore simultaneously knowing that we are not important enough in the grand schema and that we are, while we are here, we could be important enough. I think it is very well encapsulated in Aham Brahmasmi. It is not a statement of I am the universe as a statement of ahankar or uh,
Ego?
arrogance or
Yeah.
ego. It is more about if I'm not there, the rest of the world doesn't matter. You have to be here in order for the world to matter to you. And in a similar way, if I might make a very odd parallel with risk management, the risks that destroy your business are not worth taking. All the risk management only matters if the business still survives. So that concept really kind of flows through whether it's my work or it's my social life, it's my friend circle. But that entire thing really underpins how I approach my life. Yeah.
That's very insightful, Shefali. I'm just wondering, on your journey, have you had certain milestones that you think have shaped who you are today or who you are becoming? Is there a personal transformation or a major life change that you think has really shaped you in the last, or who you're becoming, as I said, because I don't think we stay steady. But and I'm curious to know about that, because I'm always wondering, what are those life incidents or life challenges that shape leaders?
I think at different points in time, different experiences have obviously influenced me. When I first left home to go to university in India, that was my introduction to two things that I had not fully kind of consciously realized. One was how rooted and how impactful caste is in India.
Mm.
And somebody challenged my choices of friends by saying, why do you hang out with XYZ? Because don't you know that they're lower caste? And I didn't even have the concept in my head that people choose their friends based on that. The second thing that struck me was growing up in a family of girls, I had not known gender discrimination from a peer group. Your sisters are your peers in a way. But in our college campus, the women's hostel, which was called the girls' hostel, a whole different conversation on infantilization of the female, used to close at 8 p.m. And anybody who returned after 8 p.m. had to explain to the warden why they were late. Whereas the men's hostels, called boys' hostels correspondingly, were open all night, as if they did not have parents and family that worried about their safety. That experience really made me think about how we see men and boys and how we see girls and women, and how easily, in the name of being protecting, in the name of being protectors, we actually restrict women's degrees of freedom while not putting any such considerations into play when it comes to boys and men. Now, I know that at the age of 17, that's quite a big thing to recognize, but there were privileges and losses associated with that as well. So while we would have liked that we had access to the library till 10 p.m. like the boys did, because their hostels were open and ours used to shut at 8 p.m. When we pushed for it, they started shutting the library at 8 p.m. Everybody was worse off, right? These things really make you reflect on who's deciding. What is there a systemic thing at play, or are you as individuals able to exercise any agency and power that is vested in you by just virtue of being individuals? Those were two really very impactful things for me, because they really made me see the world for what it was rather than what I had experienced until then. And I think the corresponding moment that I experienced when I came to the UK was some of the questions that recruiters asked me when I was looking for my next role outside the company that I worked for. I heard interesting things for which I acquired language later, about, are you here legally? Your people have children. When are you going to have children? We all now have a word for it. I did not at the time. But now I recognize that that was the kind of questioning that almost forced me down a path of being an accidental micropreneur 25 years ago, which built me the portfolio that has made me a good, effective board director today. And all of these things shape us. But for me, the key takeaway message was, in recognizing these patterns, I did not let them adversely change me. I was always an open-hearted, curious, inclusive person. That's how I was brought up, whether it was my father's friend circle that was, inclusive, multi-religious, people of different kinds of lifestyles and everything, or whether it was my own choices. I have always been that person, and I have never stopped being that person.
Mm. Thanks for sharing that, Shefali. Do you remember, taking advice from somebody as you went down this path, and again, of your own claiming an unusual path? that was particularly useful or maybe particularly harmful for you? I know the particularly harmful one always makes interesting stories, but but either way, right? I mean, what has stayed with you as you reflect back and saying, "Wow, if I had taken this advice, or if I had not taken this advice, I would be better off."
So I'm not a person who takes advice very easily. So I think it's one way of sort of sidestepping the whole question. But whenever I'm given a suggestion, I do weigh it up. Like I look at it for its merits and demerits. And equally, I take into account other people's, I would say prejudices, but their points of view, because they are seeing an outside presentation of a problem. You are experiencing an interior presentation of the problem. They also may have very different experiences from you. And therefore, their perspective has been shaped by their own sort of lived experience and their upbringing and all kinds of things. So I would say I spend so much time evaluating things that I almost never take advice as it is given to me, good or bad. So it's hard to say that I took advice and it turned out well or turned out badly. But being independent minded, which is something that was also instilled in me as a child, my dad never gave me an opinion and said, do this. In fact, I distinctly remember two moments when he tried to give me an opinion. And I kind of said, well, if you like it so much, why don't you do it? I was a very rude child by Indian standards. But the good thing about owning your own decisions is that you cannot blame them on anybody else if the outcome is poor, which is a very common fallacy in decision making. But equally, you can quietly celebrate that as a moment in self discovery, knowing what you can overcome, knowing what you can create. So I know I haven't answered your question, but this has been unpacking my.
Well, but that's your reality. And thanks for sharing that. I mean, I heard something very interesting from one of my mentors, and they said that feedback always says more about the feedback giver. And I have really kept that, very deeply in my mind. Of course, seeking feedback and, receiving feedback is useful or can be potentially useful to grow. But keeping this lens in your mind that it is always saying, something about the giver rather than about you. So creating that distance,
Mm,
I think, can be quite useful, because I see that some people feel, especially negative feedback, that it goes and settles in somebody so deep
mm,
that then they never. I remember a few years back, one of the leaders I was coaching got a very negative 360 degrees feedback report. Like several people said something very negative, and he found it very difficult to come out of that. So it became very difficult for me also as a coach to work on, look at feedback as a gift, because there was that shock factor. Like, really, do you really think, this is me? But the whole idea of creating that distance became very challenging, especially because the 360 degrees is, multi people, there are 15, 17 people, and patterns were emerging. You could claim that maybe the person was really not so self-aware, but I saw the person going in that spiral, a negative spiral. So something that was supposed to be developmental actually became detrimental. And I think that's where I like what you're saying, that yes, it's important that you listen, but then you use your mind to decide what you want to do with that, right? I think that's.
I think there is also another angle to it. Sometimes feedback or commentary is what I call drive-by commentary. If somebody is genuinely interested in your improvement or well-being, do they stick around while you go through your messy process of implementing some of the change requiring steps, right? So people not sticking around means that they are taking, I'm going to use an electronics analogy. In communication signal sampling, when are they sampling the signal? If they're sampling change things infrequently, they will notice the change. But somebody who stays with you through the process is experiencing the mess. So they may not really even notice the change when it has come in. Very few people stay with you on that journey. which is why we value, direct speaking older friends much more, who are in constant contact with us, because they are staying with you while you're navigating the messiness. And I think in feedback giving or advice giving, it's very important. If you give someone advice, are you handholding them to some extent to actually implement that advice? Otherwise, it's just like a drive-by shooting. You know, you don't
Right.
even stay around long enough to be identified as the shooter.
True that. I know you have a new book coming. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So the book is called Uncharted Spaces: Reset the Agenda, Reimagine the Boardroom. And one might think from the title that it is going to talk about my experiences. That is not the case. The book will start with briefly talking about myself, because that is where I establish why I am a person worth writing this book. Then I talk about what goes on in boardrooms. But most importantly, it's a forward thinking book which talks about how boardrooms need to reimagine what they are there to do. And in that, I'm bringing together a lot of experiences from around the world, not just in the Anglo Saxon setup in which I have functioned so far as a board director. The book is expected to come out next year, 2026, April, and I should start the marketing activity pretty soon. So you will hear more about it. And for that, literally follow me on LinkedIn.
That's great. That's great. Last question to you, Shefali. And I know you said that you do not take advice, so I don't know if you give advice, but I'd love to know if you have any pearls of wisdom, let's call it that, rather than advice, for wonder women, for high skilled immigrant women who might be navigating this whole idea of how do I fit in or how do I reinvent myself, how do I lead versus how do I belong. There's so many questions, and sometimes, and I know that though I have not seen so many of those personally, I have worked with plenty of wonder women who go through these dips, and become unsure about everything, existential and identity questioning phases that they go through. So I'm wondering, what would you say to them if they are feeling a little bit stuck at the moment?
At the risk of repeating myself and at the risk of sounding twee, I will say that it's very important to know your own core. Like, what is it that you would do and what is it you wouldn't do? Now, what is it you would do is something all of us are very good at saying, oh, I would do this, because it's a hypothetical scenario. What is it that you wouldn't do? And from an organizational perspective, business behaviors or behaviors in the workplace that we tolerate actually are what define the bottom line of a culture. So I think it is important as Wonder Women to know what your core is, what are your absolute red lines that you wouldn't cross. And from there, you can define what is the positive that you would do. Speaking out about every issue is not important, but speaking about particular issues that are meaningful to you, that have a larger impact, systemic impact as well, is important. But you wouldn't know if you don't know your red lines. So, what I'm really saying is know your core and know your boundaries. And within the core are your purpose and your values. And within your boundaries or drawing the boundaries, you know what it is that you will neither tolerate nor indulge in yourself. And I know that these sound really like vague and abstract, but we could take any situation in our life and sit with it for a moment and unpack it, and we will know that's where we have not followed any of these. That is where we feel uncomfortable. And that is where the discomfort of feeling the ups and downs comes from. I'm fairly well regulated in terms of being calm and in the middle of complicated and challenging circumstances. And that basically comes from being grounded really well in my own self. And if we are not third culture people, we are lucky to have that grounding. We have some basis of being who we are. When somebody is a third culture person, for them, it is a conscious exercise of saying, this is who I am, from where they can operate. But as people like you and me, we came from a solid grounding somewhere. We were immigrants as adults. We had quite a lot of rooting already. and we need to appreciate it for what it is. And that would be my sort of broad framework type advice to Wonder Women.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Shefaly. Thanks for your time. And we look forward to your book. I definitely am going to read your book whenever it comes. And yes, on the promos, there will be ways in which you can connect with Shefaly. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Shivangi. It's been great being here with you.